visual communication design and also in creative media. Although this past semester I was teaching all visual communication design, and I had I had a freshman class and then an upperclassman class and then a capstone class. So I kind of had a little bit of everything.
Awesome. Thanks, Robin.
I'll go next. I'm Julia Swift. I teach in filmmaking, and I also do the whole spectrum from first, I like to say, I get them coming in, I get them going out. I have a lot of first year classes and then capstone. And I have others too, but I love that I get that beginning and end.
Awesome. And Bob?
Yeah, I'm Bob Mayer in the core, and teach core classes and game studio classes usually.
Awesome. So I know that, how to phrase this. Okay, so what we're going to focus on today is the experience of teaching flex hybrid, but having your students, some of your students in person or students in person some of the time. So what I've asked the panelists to do, for those who aren't on the panel, is to just share a few things about, you know, what worked, what didn't work, suggestions, war stories, whatever seems like the most important knowledge you can impart. So we can go in the same order we just did, if that works for you all. And we'll loop back around to Robin. And then after this, we'll have lots of time for Q&A. The Q&A tool under the little geometric shapes in Meet, that is on. So if you are an audience member and you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and put your question there, and then you can also rate other people's questions so we can see which are the priority questions and stuff like that. So with that in mind.
Yeah, hi. So I taught, as I said, a mixture of freshmen and then upperclassmen. I'm not going to talk about the capstones so much because that was really a different process, but I'm going to talk about my freshman design class and my upperclassmen design class, which was a mixture of juniors and seniors. So my freshman was, probably 90% of the students were living on campus. There was a few that were living at home who were local students, but were also mostly, even within that freshman class, the ones that were living at home, most of them were commuting in for in-person classes. There also were a few transfers, both transfers to the college and also students who had declared their major, you know, a little bit later. So we had a couple of sophomores and juniors. They were all remote, interestingly enough, the sophomores and juniors who joined this freshman class. And they struggled, actually, more so than the freshmen did. I ended up, I took on a lot of extra work for myself, primarily because, well, I think we all took on extra work for ourselves, and I kind of had this moment of being faced with, do I take on extra work for myself by making videos and creating a flipped classroom, or do I make extra work for myself by teaching for more hours than I'm being paid to do? And so that seemed easier for me. So I ended up, it's complicated, and it's a little bit more complicated because of how, this is a studio class for the freshmen. So they were, you know, the credit hours are a little bit different, but to make things really simple, we couldn't fit in a classroom all at once. And so I ended up dividing the class in half, and I taught the class twice. And shortened it a little bit, and made up for the shortening by extra kind of remote activities. But I wouldn't do that again. But I really felt for the freshmen, especially because it was their major, their only major specific class. It was their only opportunity to meet other people in their program. And I really wanted, and they were also just, I felt like they were really overwhelmed by managing all of the different platforms that they were trying to engage with. So I really prioritized just giving them a consistency of being in the same classroom every week with the same group of people. Originally, I was going to try to do have half of them come remote and half of them come in person and then flip it. But again, it got really overwhelming for them. So that was the other thing, was that it was a constantly evolving process. But anyways, most of them told me, the freshmen, that this was the only class they had in person. It was their only opportunity to get out of their dorm room. Most of, so then it led to a lot of time for us to talk about mental health issues and to discuss strategies to get them off campus, like where they could go. And because they were already out of their room, it seemed more approachable, those conversations, right? Because I'd be like, right over there, like we'd kind of go out onto campus a little bit. So there was a lot of like that kind of stuff I was doing with my freshmen that was not sort of part of the plan. I did have students that were attending remotely for that class, very few actually. So so the hybrid piece really came into play in my advanced digital image class. That class was mostly juniors and seniors. There was 19 students in the class. When I got the email from the registrar's office, I was told that I think 13 were going to be attending in person. 5 actually showed up. But those 5 came back, and we discussed as a group, well, should we just go remote? Is it worth it for us to be in person? And the 5 that had chosen to be in person were pretty adamant that that was really what they wanted. And they kept on coming back. And so I came back with them. I was really worried about that class. It's a discussion-based class. I wasn't sure how it was going to unfold, having 2/3 of the students remote and 1/3 in person. And how do I facilitate a conversation that feels authentic and sort of evenly balanced between the 2 cohorts? The college did a Herculean job trying to outfit the classrooms with enough tech, but it was not necessarily the right tech in order to have the kinds of conversations I needed to have. And I don't fault, I'm not saying this to like fault IT, because they had sort of this, they had the classroom set up was that at my podium, I had a dock camera, which was essential actually, and a wide angle camera that was sort of facing me. I could turn it around and have it face the classroom, but then people became little pinpricks. And so that was the really tricky thing for me to navigate in terms of trying to create an equitable discussion. And what I ended up doing is I ended up connecting to my Zoom classroom on my phone. So I was connected on the podium when I was lecturing, but mostly this was a discussion class. So I then double connected on my phone. And then it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out how to get rid of the feedback. I actually had to call a friend who's like an AV. She's a librarian at a local high school, and she's really good with AV. And she helped me figure out the switch that I was missing to get rid of the feedback loop. And what I would end up doing is I'd turn off all of the sound at the podium, and I would just have the sound on my phone. And I basically walked around the classroom and interviewed everybody, 6 feet away. So if Julia raised her hand and had something to say, I would walk up to Julia and kind of put my camera sort of in her face so that she was projected on this, to the students who were on Zoom, the same size as they were, so it was like a headshot of Julia. And that worked remarkably well. And we had really robust conversations. And, I used to joke around, I'd turn it on myself and I'd be walking around with like a little selfie view with my mask on. And I would joke about it being like Blair Witch Project or something, right? So, and what and I also taught, and Julia, I'm sure you did, I did some lighting demos that way actually. And I taught students hands-on, kind of experiential learning through that the double modality. And I'll wrap it up to give everybody else a chance to talk, but I was nervous about what the experience, I knew that the students in front of me, it was worth it for them because they kept on coming back. And actually one day I ended up teaching remote and 3 of my students came anyways to the classroom because they wanted to be together. So that was fascinating, and watching them try to handle the tech was hysterical, but that's another story. I knew it was really working for my students who were in person. I was less certain as to how it was working for the students who were remote, but the feedback I got, and I can pull up some quotes, was universally, they loved it because I think it was entertaining, right? And while we don't necessarily want to think about teaching as performative. It very much is, right? And if you are having all of your classroom experiences are like this, what we're experiencing right now, where everything is in this grid and headshots, then to have a classroom where somebody's walking around and gesturing and pointing the camera at somebody else, even if you're just an observer, they found it to be much more engaging. And universally, they felt like it was the class that they felt most engaged in. And so I do think that, that's made me think about like even my remote teaching practice, like that maybe it's worth thinking about creating a different sort of scenario where I could be moving more physically, so that it's not sort of the stationary. So those are my big takeaways. Yeah, and also I think for my own mental health, as it turns out, and I recognize again, the students and I spent a lot of time talking about feeling safe, whether we felt safe, and I always was very clear with students that they could change their mind without, as to whether they wanted to be in person or hybrid, based on their own comfort level, and that I would be doing the same. So I want to recognize that, at least for this semester, there's no right or wrong way to assess somebody's own sense of safety. And if you do feel safe coming on campus, I encourage you to do it. For me, it was really important for my own mental health also. I actually cried in front of my student, like I started to tear up my first day of remote teaching with this advanced photo class. We really just had so much fun working through the kinks of this relationship that when I met all of them, remotely, I almost started to tear up. I didn't realize how important it was for me too. So anyways, thanks.
All right, thank you. So some similarities and some differences with all of my classes were 80% to 90% in person, and then a few online. Same thing, students were very thankful to have the ability to come in person. And I was very aware of trying to engage the students who were not in person, because I knew that they sometimes were feeling left out. And Robin had mentioned like the tiny faces on the screen. Actually, my students enjoyed being the tiny faces on the screen, as opposed to if you're in a room and you have and you're projecting onto a big screen at the front. They did not want to be projected. The students at home did not want their faces projected on the big screen in front, which I totally understand. If there are 5 of you at home, that's not a natural situation, and it does put them on display. So I would really encourage you, if you can, to either sometimes I would use my computer. Often in our classrooms, we had a second, if you have a second screen, if you can put the students who are at home on a separate screen, then they are able to be seen by the people in the room. And yet when they talk, they don't feel like they're booming from above, which was one thing that made the people at home sometimes nervous to speak. So I found that really helpful. And let's be honest, it takes a lot more mental energy to do both at the same time, to be teaching the students in the classroom and to be teaching the students at home. I was tired, really exhausted after every time. And part of it is watching the people at home and watching the people at the room and making sure that they're both understanding and connecting. And then part of it is the technology, that if you are going to be showing something on your screen that has sound, which obviously in filmmaking we do, but I think everyone does that. It's really important to turn off everything, to turn off your sound and turn off all the sound on your computer. But the problem then is when you're done and I get all excited and I see the students are all excited and I just want to start talking, if you don't then unmute it, the students at home just see everyone excitedly talking and don't feel like they're part of it. So actually, this is one time in my teaching that happened on enough of a regular basis, because again, it's one more thing that we have to think about, that I actually allowed one person in the room to have their cell phone, and the people at home had their number. at first I thought I was going to have it be my cell phone and my number, but again, I didn't need one more thing. So I would let one person in the classroom, they would have a number. And if for some reason I forgot to unmute the people at home, they would text the person in the classroom and remind me, right? So anything, and the students actually really want to help in times like that because they really want us to all be together. And I think they felt like it was making them part of the solution. So we have so much to think about that if you do have people in your class and you can be, after a while, I would be like, okay, wait, now's the time when I'm going to show something. And we would sort of all go through together. We'd be like, mute in the class, and when this is another really big hint if you're going to do that. I strongly recommend if you're going to share any sort of videos, even just short clips and things, to use Google Meet and not Zoom. Lyle and I went through and did a bunch of tests. And Google Meet has an option when you go to share a Chrome tab. And that by far is the smoothest you can get of watching something together. So that was really awesome. So yeah, it was having all of us in it together, making sure the students weren't booming from home. And another thing that I noticed from, selfishly as professors, sitting like we are right now at a computer and talking, like that's sitting for a lot. And I was getting stiff and I wasn't moving. And I found that when I was in the classroom, I'm like, oh, I'm moving. And so, yeah, for the students, but also for us. It's also just, for me, it was worth it going to school to have that. And by the way, the students were super respectful, even in film, where a lot of times you would think, oh, we all want to crowd around a piece of equipment. The students were super respectful, always wore their masks. We were always apart. And the one thing I will say that was surprising to me is I had a harder time getting to know the students in the classroom by what they looked like. I would run into them other places on campus, or sometimes, honestly, one time we had a first year. It's easier with students you've had a lot, but I had a first year class, and a student made a video and showed it, and we were all commenting on the character in the video. And finally, the student said, that's me, that this was a documentary about me. And none of us recognized her because we had only seen her in class with her mask on. So it was really interesting that, so now I definitely push the students even more than I have in the past to please upload their photo onto, Google, so that when we see onto Canvas or Google, whatever it is they want to do, so that we as professors and the students have some way of seeing what each other look like, because it helps us get to know each other. So that is another thing that was surprising to me. But yeah, all of the comments, the students were so thankful that it was in person because they get to know each other. And that was so then I thought, well, when I start doing group work, I struggled for a little bit and I tried some different things. Like, should I have group work with the students at home, intermix with the students there? And I actually found the best for me, and I guess it depends on who the students are, was to have the students at home be in one group and the students in the class be in another group. There were one or two times when somebody wasn't there and they were a little behind. And so then I would just say, here's my computer. And I would have one of the students be a group with someone at home on my computer so they could have like a big screen. But generally, I think it worked better for the students. Also because the students at home are more anxious to connect in that way offline through email. And so then they really got to know those other students at home more. And it's not like it. And then my final big note is sometimes it feels silly to repeat the questions of students in class. But it's so necessary no matter how good you think the sound is. And actually it can be a really useful thing, because sometimes I would even purposely try to recontextualize a student's question if they were asking it. A student asks a question, I can hear it, but not necessarily the students at home. So I would try and basically say what I heard, recontextualizing it. And sometimes then that would start a really interesting discussion of students in class saying that's not what they said, right? And that was really nice. Again, it was another way to get students active and involved. And it's so important for the students to hear each other. And I didn't want to keep saying to the quieter students to speak up or come close. I know one other thing we tried for a while was coming up to a microphone, and that felt that was like we're performing. We feel like we're too embarrassed to speak. So I've really found that repeating the question. I did try to do once what Robin did, where I put my computer on a chair and we just sort of kept pushing it and rolling it around whoever was going to speak. And it was funny. But I still think repeating is the best way to go with students in class. So that's it. I guess we'll move on to Bob and then answer questions.
Well, I don't really have that much to say now. Everything, all the good stuff's been said, which is great. I mean, I teach in core. Some of, it's our classes they vary. One of the things about the flex hybrid, I think that was interesting for me was, again, the split between the people who are on campus and those who are not, which you get these things saying, X number of folks are going to be totally remote. And then I think by most of the semester, I had 1 to 3 people actually in the classrooms. It was still worthwhile for those people. They were very engaged and very wanted to be there. And I was happy to be there. Again, I really liked having the regularity of going in and doing it and being on campus and the energy and stuff. But it's safety, and you got to make sure you encourage them to do what they want to. And most of them wanted to be in the classroom, but logistics. If they had 3 classes in a row and they didn't want to run back and forth to the dorms or do remote, it's understandable. But I mean, I'd echo most of the stuff that's been said. I like Zoom. I mean, I've never had any problems, particularly with the modest amount of videos I've done. If I was doing film, in gaming, we've had some issues sometimes having shifted different platforms, but for me, it wasn't an issue. Same sort of thing with the classroom. I was in MIC 305, 306, which is not one of my favorite rooms, but it worked okay. Only thing I was missing, I guess, would be a table to put the dock camera on, because it was sitting on the floor. It couldn't really be used. There was nothing to put it on. But I tried the cell phone technique. My phone ran out of batteries. So it then started to heat up. But that's a great idea. But what I normally did was I turned the camera around to face the 1 or 3 people in the classroom, projected the everything up on the big screen, so people could see each other. I didn't have particularly anybody express any reluctance to talk that way, but I took advantage of the fact I usually only had one other person in the classroom to move around, because we could still maintain the 6-foot distance. I could still move, because I cannot teach sitting down or without moving every part of my body, hands and everything. I just cannot sit there and do it. I can't talk without moving my hands either. So, we kept keeping it more dynamic that way. But I think the key thing, a couple of things. One, the whole flex hybrid thing forced me to do a lot more organization, which was good and pays off in the classroom. It puts the content delivery, at least for the type of classes I teach, into things like Canvas and offline, which leaves all of that class time for questions, interactions, discussions, explorations, and stuff. And I think that is a really good thing. It's a great way of teaching. I think it also, the other key thing is that attitude. We approached it, I think, like everybody else, talking here, Robin and Julia, from having fun. Not taking it, yes, seriously, but not super serious. It wasn't like you're preaching in a sermon or something. This was a weird situation. Acknowledge that it's weird, own the weirdness, and roll with the weirdness. I spent the first few minutes of every class just chatting with people. How's it going? What's up? How's the weather like? How's it like living with your siblings again? How are you holding up okay? Anything we can do? How's registration going? For the ones on campus, you're getting enough to eat, that sort of stuff. And I had a lot of first years too. So, trying to get them to and they liked that. They would really open up and start talking. Then we could segue into what we were teaching, considering 2 of the sections were on, higher education or whatever. So that fit pretty well. But that attitude when you're teaching these type of classes of acknowledging that what you're doing is a little different and just rolling with that, cutting students slack emotionally and sort of in terms of timing and things. I found that worked out really well. And the fact that we had the students, even if they weren't in the classroom, but they were in the dorms attending remotely, that put them in a sort of a third category. If they weren't remote, they weren't in the classroom, but they were on campus, but not in the classroom. And that, because they knew they could be in the classroom, they felt more connected in some ways, I think, because we were there. You've got interesting viewpoints because the three different groups had sort of different takes on things. So, just sort of working with that. But I really don't have much else to add except that it really does come down to that engagement and having fun and sort of not letting the technology dictate, in a sense, or limit what you want to do, but also don't feel constrained to exploit every single bell and whistle that exists. You do you, but do it in a way that works and does take advantage of the technology when it helps you get to the goals you want to. And I think that's the biggest challenge for this is we all get so much advice and so much great, suggestions and training and tutorials. There's a tendency to think we have to do all of it, which we don't. You got to be comfortable as a faculty member. You've got to be sort of cool and comfortable because then the students will respond to that. If you go in there all tense and like, oh my God, I can't stand this, that's going to bleed over into everybody else. So that was really my thing with this is it's kind of a big adventure and treating it as such. And I think the students in the comments, they really appreciated that. And as far as the pedagogy, I think most of that's been covered. There's a lot of I didn't use it for lecturing or whatever, just explaining stuff or answering questions, but use the tools, use the videos, use the sound, and, ask the students also for help. Some of them can troubleshoot stuff pretty easy. And I told them, if you're going to come to class, bring your laptop and log into the session too, and they did. They'd help me out by saying, oh, so-and-so is putting a question in there because I couldn't necessarily see what was up. And they like being engaged with that. So, all in all, it's just a different way of doing it. I think in some ways it's got, its own strengths and weaknesses. But even when we go back into the classroom for the normal stuff, I might just teach some classes like this off of, by modality, different modalities, because it's kind of cool. Yeah, managing chat tends to be tough. That's why I enlist the students. But, it was sort of a fun experience in a stressful sort of way.
Thank you all so much. That was fabulous, a fabulous set of very different advice. And I think it was interesting also to see some of the common themes that emerged there. So I put a message in the chat, by the way, learning moment. Y'all are absolutely right about the chat being hard to drive. That's why when we do webinars, we have somebody being the chat driver, which is kind of what I'm doing right now. So I would definitely encourage everybody to put your questions in the Q&A, or if you're not familiar with the Q&A tool, you can put them in the chat and I'll help field those. And we can also do questions aloud the old-fashioned way. But that was fantastic. Thanks. Does anybody want to lead off, or shall we start with a question from the Q&A list?
Craig just raised his hand.
Go ahead, Greg.
Oh, I also put questions in the chat, so in the Q&A. So.
Oh yeah. Well, I upvoted one of your questions in the Q&A, Craig. So maybe we can start with that one because it's popping up to the top now. Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. I heard different responses, so I'd love to know a little bit more about the ins and outs of. Do you have the students who are in the class have their computers or devices on and tuned into the virtual meeting as well? And what are the pros and cons of that?
I did not have students tuned into their devices. I was having a hard time dealing with my second device, right? And like managing feedback. So I was concerned. We didn't try it. I mean, maybe this semester we'll try it. Because then I think they would have to be sort of like really plugged in, you know. So I thought maybe I would try that, but we didn't. No, it was a fully. So we sort of. I barely like, and I didn't do. I did a little bit of InSpace when we were fully remote, but I just used Zoom. I would barely touch the chat. I'd make the students holler at me when there was something in the chat. Like, I really, for me, the video, like the way I did hybridity was to try to just not make the technology disappear, but use the technology to make us all feel like we're having like that we're having a more in-person experience, right? And so we did, and because I'm teaching I'm teaching design and art and tactile stuff, right? Like it's discussion, it's critique, it's work time. I don't usually do a lot of sort of technology in my kind of collaborative technology stuff in my class in pre-pandemic. So for me, the goal was just to have sort of the technology sort of disappear in a way, so the students were not engaged.
I use the students a lot of times would bring their computers and they would log in while they were there so that we could all be working on a document or working on different things. So that actually, it worked for me. And
Yeah,
also worked to help with obviously the chat.
I think there's probably a couple of different philosophies, at least in dealing with this. One of which is to make the technology transparent and go and do pretty much what you did. The other is to accept it as a different modality and then work within that modality. And I think either works. I sort of did the second, in the sense that rather than adapting or trying to torture what I would do in a physical classroom into that format, I sort of tried to adapt a different format that was more native to the technology. And I don't think either approach is necessarily better than the other. It depends on what you're comfortable with. But, you know, so technology was there. We used it if we had, but again, my sample size was too small because I only had 1 to 3 people in the classroom. If I had half and half, it might have been a more valuable sample. But and I think that brings up a point about things like InSpace and such. Tools that work beautifully when everybody's remote or when everybody's in the classroom don't usually work very well when you're split. And this is the sort of the territory we're in, where you have to be very innovative and sort of patient, because it's really nothing is that we have, at least, seems to be built for that mixed environment.
For hybridity, yeah. And I would say that like my class that was 90% in person, again, was more so, and especially this particular class. In the spring, the classes I'll be teaching are more digitally oriented. I'll teach a digital photography class. So in my fall classes, because of the content of the course, we weren't on computers, you know, and so for me, the technology sort of disappeared into the background. In the spring, at least 6 credits of my course load is a very computer heavy class, even pre-pandemic again. So that will be different, right? To have students in the classroom all of them on computers. I might look at different ways of approaching that.
Thanks. I want to jump to a question that Devin put in the chat, that I know we've all probably encountered this, either in person, like in class, or in the drugstore or whatever. What about having a tough time hearing students who have masks on?
So it's funny because at first I would ask people to repeat things again and again without, like, because they had their masks on. And then I started to realize that it did tend to be the shyer students who weren't speaking up as much, and I didn't want to put them on the spot. So what I started doing was blaming it on air conditioning and heating. I do think it's because they're already having a hard time. Right. And so to me, yeah, that does happen to all of us, first of all, just to know. And so I would say, I'm here, the air conditioning is right by me, the heater's right there. Can you please say it louder or repeat it again? And you just have to keep doing it. It is one of the more frustrating things.
For me, that was like my compromise was I would move around the classroom. I would maintain 6 feet distance at all times, and I wouldn't stay in one place for very long. So I wouldn't stand, 6 feet away from a student for more than a couple of minutes, but that way I could get a little bit closer to them so I could hear them better. But that was challenging. And then also I was sort of having them be heard. I wanted the students, because I tried what Julia suggested about repeating. I used to joke with the students, it was like being at an Occupy Wall Street protest, because like they'd say something and then I'd like repeat. I'd be like, Julia said, and it was like, and I spent so much, and we're trying to have this like rich and organic conversation about like critiquing work, right? So letting the students' voices be heard by the people remotely was really important. For the kind of discourse we were having. But yeah, the masks, and some of them, like some of it is like I wanted to give them all like, because I spent a lot of time finding masks that were both protective, but also I could speak, like I bought like 1 million masks, right? And then had to find the ones that I could be heard in. So I wanted to almost buy some of the students better masks that didn't muffle them so much. Craig, I ended up using the front-facing camera when I was talking, and then the rear-facing camera when the students were talking, because that way I didn't have to. It was like one less thing for me to think about, so I would just kind of like. No, actually, I would go back and forth. It was sort of all over the place. But I think that's what I did, because that way I could sort of make sure that I was on the camera, so I'd have the forward facing, and then that way, I wanted to be able to see them. I wanted to be able to know what the students on the screen were seeing, so I would switch it depending on if I was recording myself or somebody else.
Here's one that's popping up in the chat and also in the Q&A, I think. About the attrition in numbers of students who are actually showing up in person, which I think a couple of you mentioned. How did you, having done all this adaptation to Flex Hybrid to begin with, how did you have to then adapt again as those numbers changed?
There wasn't any change in the teaching necessarily, because one of the beauties of this thing is it really is independent of the mix. I mean, it's Flex Hybrid. I mean, the mix is going to shift. The problem for me was not really a problem, was that I spent a lot of time developing elaborate rotation schedules for all the hordes of people who wanted to be in the classroom, and didn't have to do. After explaining it all to them, it didn't work because didn't need it, because nobody showed up. And I'm facing the same thing this semester with one of my classes. So I think I'm going to use the 2 weeks this semester that we're totally remote to just sound people out to see if get a really accurate account of who's going to be showing up, because the other classes are fine, but there's one class says they have 15 people who want to be there. My betting is that's going to decrease, so I may not have to do it. But for me, I think that the pedagogy doesn't really shift that much in terms of its formal structure. The psychology of how you deal with it and just sort of how you divide your attention and that sort of balance will change, because the critical mass of the student shifts from one place to another. But that's sort of a dynamic thing that is not so much about your syllabus or anything.
Go ahead, Julia. You look like you have.
I was just gonna, so for me, I found it had a lot to do with what was on the syllabus. So like there was 1 week when not a lot of people came, because there wasn't a lot of in-class work and interaction. And then as soon as I changed that, by the end, I had people who were online now coming in. And by then I had almost everybody in person. So part of that was, for me, was letting the students know that there would be more time where they would be working with each other, or where we would be working on projects. If they thought that we were going to be, lecture to or watch something, a lot of it, then I understand for them. They were like, why come in? So for me, I felt like making it really clear a week before on the syllabus what was going on.
That's interesting. I also think, one thing to consider, there's sort of the emergent mode that we're in sort of managing this hybridity in the pandemic. But then I think Bob earlier mentioned kind of like, what does it look like moving forward, right? Like, and I'm really excited about this idea that like we could have students for some reason, we could create systems within the college for students to be attending classes remotely for different kinds of reasons. Maybe they're doing an internship in a, someplace else, or, there's lots of different ways we could imagine that. So, and that becomes more of the situation where you've got like 90% in the classroom and 10% not in the classroom. Whereas right now, I think many of us are seeing sort of the reverse, right? So I found that there was a lot of, I think similar to Bob, that I had a lot of attrition early on. And then students became committed to whatever modality they had chosen. That being said, in both classes, and again, the advantage of having hybrid for an in-person class is I did have some students whose cars wouldn't start, who had a migraine, who, had to leave campus to go visit their family. And normally those students wouldn't have come to class. And, as we all know, like a lot of those students came remotely on those days. So again, like, even if we were doing a fully in-person without hybrid, I could imagine a scenario where I have a Google Meet link. Let me know that you can't make it to physical class, and you can call in for the session, right? So they're not missing as much content. So, but it was quite consistent once we settled in. But yeah, definitely the first couple of weeks there was a lot of sort of like attrition.
Awesome. Thank you. We're scheduled to run until 4:15 and it is 4:17. So I don't want to keep the panel over time, but I would say if you have any questions, feel free to email them to me and I will find you an answer. Unless panelists, if you want to take one more question right now, we can do that. But I know that a couple of us also have other meetings to get to.
I got to run to another meeting. Sorry.
Right. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for coming. This has been great. And thank you to our
Yeah, thanks.
input.
Yeah, it was fun.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.